Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're taking a pretty wild historical journey to figure out exactly how our modern drug safety regulations were born. And spoiler alert, they were born out of absolute chaos. We mostly take for granted that the pill we swallow to cure a headache or, say, fight off an infection is perfectly safe. But getting to this point, well, it required navigating a bizarre and often deadly landscape of unregulated potions, massive political turf wars, and undeniable national tragedy. So let's dive right into this.
Restore life in the event of sudden death. Think about that for a second. That was an actual, completely legal marketing claim for something called Dr. Sibley's solar tincture back in the 19th century. It perfectly highlights the total lack of empirical science and just the sheer audacity of early patent medicines. Literally, if a salesman wanted to claim his bottle could raise the dead, there was absolutely no regulatory body to stop him.
So, what was actually in these so-called miracle bottles? Well, the grim reality behind all that grandiose marketing was basically a cocktail of poison. These elixirs relied heavily on staggering doses of opiates, cocaine, or just straight alcohol. Sure, people taking them might have felt temporarily cured, or, let's be real, just high, but in a lot of cases they were actively being poisoned. Ingredients like acetaldehyde or cresyl phosphate were super common. And cresyl phosphate, by the way, it's an organophosphate that actively causes nerve paralysis. Just terrible stuff.
Chapter 1. The Wild West of Medicine and the Allure of Nostrums.
Back in the 1800s, America was urbanizing really fast. Traditional, passed-down household remedies were quickly being replaced by this bustling new marketplace, and an increasingly urban population developed a massive appetite for mysterious medical elixirs. Marketers totally fed this appetite by deliberately preying on the public's desire for the exotic. You had brands like Kickapoo Indian Sagwa and Mac Mahan, the rattlesnake oil king, using these captivating, wild images to sell cures for literally everything from a common stomachache to cancer. It was brilliant marketing, for sure, but it was masking incredibly dangerous products.
Take William Radham's microbe killer, for example. It boldly declared it could cure all diseases. The absolute absurdity of a single bottle curing every known ailment is obvious to us today, but remember, the government had zero power to stop these fraudulent claims at the time. It was a complete free-for-all.
Chapter 2. Iowa's Prohibition Pharmacy War.
Now, to really understand how regulation began to take shape, we actually have to look locally before we look federally. In the 1880s, the battle over what could even be sold in a pharmacy became hopelessly intertwined with the politics of the era. Early regulation wasn't purely about medical safety, it was deeply political. On one side, we had ambitious pharmacists who desperately wanted to professionalize their trade, ensure safe compounding, and define their jurisdiction by statute to distance themselves from the quacks. But on the other side, we had the powerful temperance movement. Their main goal was stamping out dram shops, which were essentially illegal bars, and enforcing strict controls on alcohol, which at the time was widely used as a medical solvent.
Believe it or not, these conflicting agendas actually created a temporary alliance. In 1880, a pharmacist named George Schaefer pushed through the landmark Iowa Pharmacy Law. It vested the sole right to compound prescriptions and dispense poisons exclusively to licensed pharmacists. This briefly united the professionalizers and the temperance advocates, mostly because Schaefer promised the law would weed out unprincipled liquor dealers who were basically using pharmacies as a front.
But, as you might guess, that alliance fractured pretty quickly. In 1882, temperance forces pushed through something called the Doubtful Substitute. This was a really ambiguous legislative measure that required pharmacists to obtain retail liquor permits and post substantial bonds, basically treating them just like common saloon keepers. It led to this decade-long skirmish that burdened pharmacists with policing prohibition. It perfectly showcases how early drug regulation was driven just as much by cultural and political wars as it was by actual public health.
Chapter 3. Muckrakers and Minor Reforms.
So while the states were busy fighting these local culture wars, the federal landscape was starting to shift. Investigative journalists began exposing the dangerous market manipulations of the medicine industry to the masses. In 1906, Samuel Hopkins Adams published a really famous exposé in Collier's magazine called The Great American Fraud. Accompanied by a striking, grim illustration of a skull, Adams just completely laid out the horrific truths behind the patent medicine industry, detailing the toxic ingredients and false promises that were literally killing people.
All this public outrage generated by the Muckrakers led directly to the 1906 Pure Food and Drugs Act. This was a big deal, the first major federal attempt at regulation. It prohibited the interstate commerce of misbranded drugs and successfully forced some makers to remove hidden narcotics. However, it was ultimately a massive, flawed loophole.
Because of subsequent Supreme Court rulings, it totally failed to stop exaggerated therapeutic claims, and worse, it couldn't prevent dangerous, completely untested substances from reaching consumers. Safety simply wasn't a prerequisite for sales yet.
Chapter 4. The 1937 Sulfanilamide Disaster.
That fatal loophole set the stage for a horrific national tragedy that finally served as the breaking point for federal law. In 1937, a company called Massengil wanted to create a liquid version of a popular drug for streptococcal infections, primarily because liquid elixirs were just a lot easier for children to take. To dissolve the drug, their chief chemist used a sweet-tasting solvent called diethylene glycol. The lethal oversight here is just staggering. Diethylene glycol is literally a chemical analog of antifreeze. But because the 1906 law did not require safety testing, they just bottled it up and shipped it out across the country.
The result was absolutely devastating. 107 people died, agonizing deaths. And tragically, because the elixir was formulated specifically to be sweet and palatable, many of those victims were young children. It was a stark, undeniable failure of the entire regulatory system.
The legacy of that deadly bottle of Elixir Sulfanilamide grounds this whole history in a really stark reality. It wasn't just an abstract legal loophole anymore. That little bottle became the urgent, unavoidable push for modern, sweeping legislation. The public and the government finally realized that retroactive punishment wasn't going to cut it anymore. Safety had to be proactive.
Chapter 5. Building the Modern FDA.
So the government finally stepped in to build the rigorous safety net that we all rely on today. In direct response to the 1937 disaster, Congress passed the 1938 Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Now, the core power of this act really cannot be overstated. It fundamentally shifted the burden of proof. For the very first time, a pharmaceutical company had to prove their drug was safe before they could ever market it to the public, and they had to do that by submitting a new drug application to the FDA.
Over the rest of the 20th century, the FDA's authority was systematically strengthened. Honestly, usually in response to new crises. In 1941, insulin purity testing was required. In 1962, the Kefauver-Harrison amendments demanded that drugs not only be safe, but actually be proven effective. In 1982, following the tragic cyanide poisonings, tamper-resistant packaging became mandatory. And in 1983, the Orphan Drug Act incentivized research for rare diseases. Layer by layer, crisis by crisis, the regulatory framework grew into the incredibly robust system we know today.
Which brings us to a final thought. Think about the medicine sitting in your cabinet right now. How much trust do you put in that simple bottle, especially when you compare it to a patient 150 years ago who might have literally been drinking antifreeze or snake oil? We take our medical safety completely for granted, but it is built on an immense, often unseen history of tragedy, relentless advocacy, and strict regulation. So, the next time you twist the tamper-resistant cap off of a clinically proven medication, ask yourself, what other unseen protections are silently shaping your everyday life? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning and keep learning.